Hey everyone, I wanted to welcome you to week 2, and now we get the opportunity to talk about rhetoric and argument. Now I know many of you in this class, you may not be familiar with the word rhetoric. Some of you may have never heard of the word before. So this is really just kind of an introduction video to kind of give you an idea of rhetoric and argument work. At the end of this video, there'll be a discussion board question that you'll get to be able to define what you think the word rhetoric means. So a couple of things we have to talk about. Before we can talk about argument, we have to talk about rhetoric first, because rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So what we first have to do is to define, what does the term rhetoric mean? Now generally, like in a ground class, I can ask this term and you can just see students panic, right? There are girls who start to cry, there are guys who are like, F this, I'm dropping the class. Right, so I think it's important that when we start with defining the term rhetoric, we need to kind of simplify the process. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about the people who use rhetoric. So, when we think about the term rhetoric, I think it's safe to say we can agree that there are people who use rhetoric. We may not know what the term means, but we know there are people who use rhetoric. And if we think about some of those people, generally in a ground class, the first group that always comes to mind is politicians. Politicians are always associated with the term rhetoric. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because we've just ended a political presidential campaign, and so throughout the last year or so, you might have heard President Trump is using rhetoric. You might have heard, candidate Joe Biden is using rhetoric. Okay, I've heard the word. It went out one year, out the other. I'm not sure what it means, but at least we can associate the term rhetoric with politicians. The second group that students always associate rhetoric with is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. And so notice in many cases lawyers are paid, right, to defend a client, and they have to do that by using rhetoric. So the first two groups of students, even in a class where I can have a class where no one has ever heard the term rhetoric, they immediately know that politicians and lawyers use rhetoric. Some other groups that often get associated with rhetoric are philosophers. We think about Socrates or Plato are famous for rhetoric. Writers are associated with rhetoric. And then oftentimes teachers are associated with rhetoric. Okay, so if we just basically have a base idea, here are the people who use rhetoric. Politicians, lawyers, teachers, philosophers, students. Let's be honest, students use rhetoric and sometimes they aren't very good at it. Well, then I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. What might a form of rhetoric be? So if we think about, just in the last week, we've had a presidential inauguration, and there it is that we know that President Joe Biden has used rhetoric. Well, when Biden went and gave his inaugural address, he was using rhetoric. Well, what was he doing, right? He was giving a speech. So a speech can be a form of rhetoric. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, right? How are you going to communicate with how a politician is going to communicate? They're going to communicate giving a speech. Now, sometimes I can ask my students, if this were a couple years ago, I'd say, how many people have heard former President Barack Obama speak? Interesting enough, sometimes I'd get some students who would raise their hand. They would have seen him speak in person. They served in the military, but most students wouldn't raise their hands. And I would ask the question, well, how did you see Obama speak if it wasn't live in person? And they'll say TV. So notice TV can be a form of rhetoric. One could argue that President Trump was very good at using rhetoric through TV. So a form of rhetoric could be a speech. It could be a form of, it could be TV. Another way could be radio. Movies could be a form of rhetoric. And if we think about all of these things through the inaugural address, right, most of us, if we had watched the inauguration of Joe Biden, we would have seen it through TV, that President Trump was very good at using technology. So technology can be a form of rhetoric, whether it's Facebook, Twitter. So technology can be a form of rhetoric. If we know that writers are the people who use rhetoric, that form of rhetoric could be a book, a newspaper, or a magazine. So all I want to do to start off class is to say, Here are the people that use rhetoric: politicians, lawyers, teachers, philosophers, right? We know there are forms of rhetoric, whether it's TV, a speech, a book. Those are forms of rhetoric. Now I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And my definition of rhetoric is words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. So throughout the term, I will define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And so what I want you to do after you've watched this video is there's going to be a discussion board, and I want to know, just based on this video, you don't really have to do any outside research, I prefer not, based on this video and kind of our discussion, how would you define rhetoric and why? And then I'd also kind of like to know whether or not you agree or disagree with my definition of rhetoric. And again, my definition of rhetoric as of week 2 is words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And what this will do is it'll give us a base to establish our class. And from here we can kind of examine how rhetoric works and if there's another definition you might prefer to define rhetoric. So I'll look forward to seeing what you say on your discussion board, and then we'll keep on pushing forward from there.